Welcome to Rough Drafts, How God Writes His Love in Our Stories, a podcast that explores the faith journeys of our friends and neighbors in Burns, Tennessee. Everyone has a story to tell, and in this podcast, we'll hear powerful and inspiring stories of how God works in the ordinary lives of people like you and me. Our stories are unfinished and perfectly imperfect. They are just rough drafts, a glimpse of what is to come because God is still at work, writing plot twists, introducing new characters, and bringing good even from the most challenging circumstances. Join us as we see what God is up to in our stories. Here's your host, Matthew Hyatt.
So today's podcast episode is one that I feel like I should get to brag about to the people who were mean to me in middle school, because I am sitting across the desk from a cheerleading national champion and Miss America, Miss Ohio, Miss Bucksnort. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but I'm sitting in the same room with someone that I never thought I'd get to sit with. This is going to be pretty cool. Welcome, Miss Brittany Watson.
Thank you. I thought you were going to set standards super low, so now I feel like, there's a lot to explain here.
Well, yeah, and you've got some stories you have to tell now, I guess. They say that low expectations are the secret to happiness.
Okay.
So I just try to make sure people know I'm kind of horrible most of the time, and then they might like me better.
Oh, gracious. This should be fun.
Well, we've been worshiping together for a few years now. If you've been listening to the podcast, we've heard from your daughter already, and She is amazing and smart and eloquent and a little frightening how cool she was. Your husband's really cool, and I've met your parents. Your father-in-law is your father-in-law, Steve. Everybody knows Steve. He gives us the encouragement every Sunday of not blowing it on the way into church, which is super helpful.
Yeah.
So I bet you've got
They're
some
amazing.
stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I didn't grow up in Dickson County, which a lot of people here in Burns have. So I think it kind of makes sense to kind of back up and describe where I grew up and sort of the people that raised me, since, I'm not from this area. And actually, we moved to Burns in 2020. So we haven't really been here that long either.
Did y'all get here before COVID or during?
It was December 2020. So, yeah.
Okay.
Sort of in the middle. I don't even remember.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, so we were in person when we joined. I think it was March.
Yeah, March is when all that started. So I have a buddy whose first Sunday for a church was the first Sunday that everything shut down.
Oh,
and I gave him a hard time because I said the only reason he still had a job was the church didn't have to meet him for 8 weeks. But so you guys landed here in the middle of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but even before that, so I grew up in Ohio. And it's funny because the place I grew up in is not even considered a town. It's really considered a village. So the village of Chesapeake, Ohio is where I grew up. And it is the very southern tip of Ohio, a very rural area. It borders the Ohio River beside Huntington, West Virginia. So Huntington was kind of like the place. That's where Marshall University is, if you're familiar with that. That's kind of where all the hospitals and the bigger town near us was. So the town though I grew up in, and everybody knew everybody. My parents grew up there. My grandparents grew up there. I went through the public school system there, like kindergarten through 12th grade. The kids I met in kindergarten were the same people I was graduating high school with. So not a lot of, change. It was a great community, honestly. As an adult, I think I appreciate it more because I see, how special of a place it was.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't just my parents raising me. It was their friends and, my parents, friends, grandparents. It was a community, and everybody kind of knew your business and everybody knew what you were doing. So that sort of would keep you in check as well.
That is wonderful and terrible.
Exactly. Yeah. I feel like as a young person, that's a good thing. So I just had great coaches, great teachers, just a lot of support in that community growing up. And so my parents, I'm an only child. I don't know if you knew that.
Did not.
Okay. So my parents both raised me together, and my dad worked in the trades. So he worked in commercial construction as an insulator, and then my mom worked in the union hall that my dad worked in as an office manager for like 20 plus years.
Yeah.
So I think they instilled in me just work ethic, what it looked like to work hard. I always knew love, like unconditional love from them. Obviously as an only child, there's a lot of pressure with that, but it's also, it was just always about me. So,
well, as it should be. You've explained this to Ben, right?
Yeah, that'll explain a lot later in my story. But then so because they worked, my grandmother, I would stay with her a lot in the summer, and so she lived next door to us, and so she always made sure that we had a home cooked meal every night. She just really was nurturing. I would say she was an old school Church of Christ lady, who also kept everybody in line. But she's still with us and still lives next to my parents in that town. So that's
cool.
Kind of the backdrop.
Yeah.
So with that, like I grew up in the church. I grew up Church of Christ. I went to Norway Avenue Church of Christ, which was in Huntington. Kind of, we had a decent sized membership. I'd say 200 to 300 members. So I was always involved in the youth group. I did mission trips, FCA. I knew what it looked like to be a part of a strong, church community growing up.
Yeah.
After high school, when I graduated high school, I went to Lipscomb University. So I didn't really know anyone, and I don't think I cared at that point. Like I was 18, I was ready to kind of get out of that small town, and I had a few people in my youth group that had gone there and loved it. So I left for Nashville, and I think, during that time, and as a young person, I didn't realize like what that transition would look like. Like I said, I'd always known everyone I grew up with. I hadn't really established like new friendships or been to, even a big city where I didn't know hardly anyone. And
that's a big move.
It was. And I would say it wasn't an easy launch at all. And I struggled through it. I think that's the first time too that I really felt like church was a requirement.
Okay.
And it always been, strongly suggested that I be a part of church, and but it was never like forced on me.
It was just what you did.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, back then there were so many rules, and I just couldn't figure out like how that was going to help me get closer to God.
Yeah.
And it did very much in my 18-year-old mind feel like it was being forced. And so that didn't kind of sit well on top of just being away from family. I mean, I was 5.5 hours away from, the people that loved me and kind of knew these struggles I was having. And I, quite frankly, just found my way into the party crowd.
Yeah.
And that didn't work out well either.
Okay.
I was there for 3 semesters, and I think my parents had then caught on and said, hey, you need to move back home.
Yeah, this ain't working.
And it wasn't. And so that was a very humbling experience in and of itself to, be 19 years old, moving back in with your parents. And I actually did a semester to finish out my sophomore year at Marshall University there. And so I was home. I just kind of loaded up on classes and made up for, the time I spent having fun for those for those years here. Mm-hmm. So once I finished out that sophomore year, I always wanted to go to Ohio State. And so I applied there and was accepted. But even before that, when I was at Marshall, I had an awesome professor that taught economics. And so before then, I didn't really have a lot of direction, like what I was going to major in or what I wanted to do. And so, when I applied to Ohio State, I got, into the business school, which was competitive in economics. And that's really, I think it was a good change for me. So I moved to Columbus, which is a pretty big city. Not a lot of people know that. So I'm just...
It's in Ohio.
Exactly. It's like if it's not Cincinnati or Cleveland, it kind of gets missed and skipped over. So that was good. I felt like I was kind of thriving there. I was happy with school. I had a great internship opportunity. So I actually got to intern in the governor's office.
Oh, cool.
The Ohio governor at that time was Bob Taft, and his grandfather was President Taft. So it was really cool how I felt like I was finding kind of my way.
Yeah.
And so I got really good at taking notes, which sounds like it's not that big of a deal.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, no, I got really good, skilled at listening and taking notes. And during that time too, in that internship, which we'll get into this later, but part of my job was reviewing grant applications from nonprofits looking for funding.
Okay.
And so I would screen those grant applications and make sure that they were meeting the state's eligibility requirements before they could be passed on, to other people to kind of evaluate the
pretty
bid.
Significant job for you.
Yeah, I mean, as an intern, I was impressed that they let me do that.
Yeah, like when I hear intern in the governor's office, I kind of assume like you're giving tours and getting coffee.
Yeah. I know. I was shocked. So I got to do that. That's the same year that I also was in a pageant, and I had done pageants previously, like in middle school, like 8th grade, and then a little in high school. And so I actually won a Miss Ohio pageant that year. So I just had a lot of responsibility. And so that was kind of approaching my senior year of college. I was in business school. I was interning. I, had this title that required a lot of me just in appearances and public speaking and a lot of that. So it all seemed like it was good, but there was a lot happening kind of underneath.
Yeah.
And so I would say during that time, I did not have, church wasn't a part of my life.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I was so self-reliant, and I frankly, I hate saying this, but I didn't need God at that point in my life.
Everything else was going fine.
Right.
You were in charge of your career. You were in charge of college. You were making good decisions. What you need him for.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Which that also doesn't turn out well.
No, but I'm really glad that you would be willing to just say it for what it is, because that line of thinking, I think almost everybody has that line of thinking, but not everybody has the ability to recognize that that's what the line of thinking was, and that it doesn't end well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just, my roommate at the time, she was Jewish and grew up Jewish. I had friends that were Catholic. And so I would kind of bounce around. And it wasn't like I ever doubted, my belief system or, was exploring other things. But I just really felt like I was okay doing it on my own. Mm-hmm. And so after I graduated, I ended up, so I graduated college in 2007. That was the time that the recession had hit. And so jobs were very difficult to find. But I got, again, very lucky in getting an opportunity to work in a corporate job. So Nationwide Insurance is headquartered in Columbus, which is a very big employer there, similar to like Bridgestone in Nashville. So landing that job was just huge for me. And it really, I think, was because of my experience with kind of the bid and the grant process. So in the corporate world, it's kind of similar, but you submit what is called a proposal instead. So, you still have to contract with employer groups. And so I had that experience, and I kind of really fell into place nicely there. But again, just required a lot of time. I was in that job, 2 or 3 years when I decided to go back to school and get my MBA. And so I was just running the corporate rat race, and just everything was about achievement, was about income, was, it just, I was seeking acceptance from, and all these things were good,
Yeah, you weren't a heroin dealer.
Right. Yeah. So I didn't at the time see how that could ever be bad.
Yeah. Again, man, what a sentence, because the pursuit of good things, how could that ever be bad?
Yeah.
You're about to tell us, I think.
Yeah. I'm about to drop it. Yeah, here we go. So during that time, I was probably in my late 20s. I had been in a long-term relationship for about 8 years, and it ended just kind of abruptly. I was blindsided by some of the things that had been going on, and so that was really hard to cope with. And I think leading up to that, I probably used work as an escape from some of the realities that were going on, and my relationships with people. And so, I kind of neglected some things, and I just had this breaking point of, wow, it was just this point of desperation almost. Like, I felt so alone. I felt, betrayed. I felt all of these things. And I look around and I'm like, wow, I don't really have anywhere to turn, because I did so well at hiding it. I had so much pride wrapped up in my accomplishments that I didn't want to burden people with, oh, I'm not doing okay. So I kind of put on this front for a while. Like, I was just afraid to kind of deal with the mess and things going on. And so, I've always been really close with my mom and close friends, but it's just, I couldn't have them kind of carry that burden or weight of what was going on.
Yeah.
And so for a while, I think I just sort of hid from some of those things. And eventually I just remember having this night where I just went to God in prayer and was like laying on the floor, just like, please help me. I'm completely alone in this moment, and like, I need you now. And God had, I would pray during those years, but God was always distant because I didn't have a personal relationship. And so during that time before, I had a neighbor who lived directly across the street from me at the time, and she would always text me about her church and like going to church, and just kind of relentless, honestly, like almost to the point where it got on my nerves, like, golly, I'm gonna have to go. But finally I gave in. I was like, okay, I'll go. But I think the reason that for so long I said no was I just didn't want to deal with the mess it was going to cause. And I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I knew I had been around church enough to know that when I made that decision, it was going to completely wreck me. Like, it was going to be this unraveling and this, like, I was going to have to tear down all those walls. And I was so self-reliant. It was hard. And finally, though, after that prayer and after that point of just, this is not working, this has got to get better, I started going to church with her. And then even better, I started to, through that church, joined a women's small group study. Mm-hmm. And so that was really a turning point for me, because it wasn't a large group, but I could kind of share my story and listen to other people share their stories. And it just became freeing, to know that we're not meant to walk alone, and we're not meant to have these struggles. Like, we should be in community. And so that, just seeing that and having that friendship, that Christian friendship, was new in my adult life. And so my friend, during that kind of season and I still remember this, and that's why I want to talk about it. She wouldn't just text me and say, hey, I'm praying for you. It was like, here's my prayer for you this morning. Oh, wow. And she would type out the entire prayer, in her conversation with God. And she would challenge me on just tough questions like, things you didn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
It wasn't surface level stuff.
Yeah. She dug in deep and didn't just pretend that nothing was there to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. And so I knew God sent her, to me to kind of walk through that. And so I was part of that ladies study in that group for, I'd say, about a year. And then I really started to get in a healthier place and think, what am I doing in Ohio? So I remember it was one winter, and it was like you would shovel the driveway, and then it just would never melt. Like it just kept piling up.
Getting taller and taller.
Yeah, taller and taller. I was like, I can't. And so at that point, I was working for a company out of California, so I was fully remote. I could live anywhere. And so I thought, I think the best thing is just to kind of start fresh somewhere.
Yeah.
And kind of start just the next chapter. And so because I had known people in Nashville and through Lipscomb, I had a friend, I had reached out to her, and I just said, hey, thinking about visiting Nashville. It's kind of one of the only other places I knew and lived before. So I came to visit. And so that was 2014. And I ended up moving here. So I felt like this time around I was in a better place. I was definitely more mature, was more established. But I knew, though, and through the work, that I had done before I left in that group, that I needed to get plugged in. So I was renting in Green Hills, and I actually was visiting Cross Point in downtown Nashville. And so I found a ladies group through that.
Yeah.
And I also was working with a Christian counselor and, had therapy I was working through, just a lot of things that I had avoided for 8 years.
Yeah.
And that was extremely helpful. I feel like I was finally able to kind of shed some of the things that, from my past that I wasn't proud of, and kind of move on, forgive myself, forgive others that, I had been holding on resentment towards. And so that was hard work, but it was necessary. And so during that time is also when I met Ben. Okay. And so, I knew at that point, like, he was a catch.
Yeah.
But I also knew I was a mess,
okay.
Right? And I told him, I was like, you don't want any part of this. Like, I am working through this stuff. Like, I can't really take on this relationship because I'm still trying to process things that had happened previously. And, he was like, it's fine. I understand. Like, I'll be here if and when you're ready. And, and he was. And so, once we start, after that, not long after that, we started dating, and then we were married. And then a year after we were married, almost to the day, we had our first daughter. Aww. So, that was pretty quick too. Like, here I am, I'm married, I have a baby. And that, I remember we were working with a premarital counselor before we got married. And he told us, his advice was like, whatever you do in your first year of marriage, don't make any, major life changes. And here we have a dog, a baby, a new house. Like, we were
so you really
going
listened to that part.
all of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good because most of what premarital counseling says is garbage anyway.
Yeah. But he probably had a point there. So that just felt kind of accelerated in and of itself. But so I will say the transition into motherhood terrified me. Having grown up as an only child, I was never around babies.
Yeah.
I was always around adults. I didn't have this huge family where there were kids around all the time.
You weren't always the babysitter.
No, never. And I remember I hadn't even changed a diaper. Like, that's how far removed I was from it. And I remember getting ready to go on maternity leave and just closing my laptop and just bawling. Like, I was completely terrified. Like, okay, I'm going to have this baby and I don't even know what I'm doing. And just a lot of insecurity, I think, during that. So I would say the first year was a transition phase for us. And then we figured it out. But you know how it is.
Oh, you have it all figured out now? That's really cool. Would you write a book?
Yeah. Well, after we figured out how to sleep, I guess. That. once you get sleep, it kind of changes everything. So,
that is kind of the most important thing of keeping a child alive and keeping each other alive. And I remember at one point the pediatrician said, you might just need to turn off the monitor for a little while.
Yeah.
Once you're sure that, the kid is safe and full and clean, maybe they can just cry for a little while every once in a while. And that was kind of like, that was a game changer when the pediatrician said that.
Yes. Yeah, we needed that advice for sure. But I had, we had my in-laws here in town. And so that really, I think that's when I started to develop a relationship with Jane and just how rich that was.
She's
she
really
is
cool.
Yeah, she is an awesome Nana and just taught me like everything I needed to know about raising a baby and what that meant, how important it is. And so, we were both kind of getting used to each other, getting used to being new parents. And so I think after a year, we kind of started to settle in a bit more. And, just adjusting to married life and having her. But I would say, so during that time, we were living in Franklin, Bellevue area. And then as I had mentioned at the start of the podcast, we moved to Burns. But right before that, so in 2019, I found out I was pregnant again with our second daughter. And I had her March 23rd, 2020. So I think that's exactly when the world shut down.
It pretty much was.
Yeah. And so that was scary. It was scary having a baby. During that time, I remember checking. My doctor had recommended that I have an induction just based on hospital regulations and everything that was going on. And so we were checking in the hospital, and they had people in the front, like in the hazmat suits.
Yeah.
And just, I remember being so terrified, like, what if Ben has a fever? And what if I'm in here alone, like having this baby? And it was so sad because I thought all the joy that a new life brings in here, you don't get to fully experience that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of families who got robbed in that time. And I'm not even criticizing, because I think, people did what they thought was best. And,
right.
And in hindsight, you can have different decisions. But in the moment, if you don't know what you're dealing with, I get why we did what we did. But, man, that was tough.
Yeah, it was.
I remember one time we had just a checkup pediatrician thing. And you know how you have to do all those forms on the tablets now?
Yeah.
And I had both kids at the same appointment because we just tried to do that to make life easier. And it was the COVID questions at the beginning, and I answered one of them wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And, then they're like, you can't be here. You can't be here. Like, no, I mean, we're fine.
Car.
Like, And it took a minute till I convinced them that we had answered, like, I just clicked the wrong thing because this is the second time I've read these same stupid questions. Ugh.
I know. Yeah. And so how often you have with a newborn, those check-ins. And so all of it was just really difficult to navigate. And, but I think it was scary, especially having a newborn, but it was also, she was so much light, and so much joy. And so, with a newborn, you're going to be staying home anyway.
Yeah.
And, nobody else is out doing that. So it also was sort of a good time to have a baby, and just kind of, we were all together and we were home and we could enjoy her. And so, it was an interesting time. But I think during that, I was just wrestling with whether or not to go back to work. And so thankfully I had a long, paid maternity leave to kind of figure it out. But I just began praying and really looking for, God to lead us through this time. My employer at that time said, I was actually working in downtown Nashville, but, they said, hey, we're probably going to be hybrid or, fully remote, at least for a year, figure it out.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, how can you work with a newborn and a toddler? That's not, that was not going to work. So there really wasn't a way that I felt. And I felt this kind of nudge, I need to prioritize my family. I've got this time it just was this kind of call that I needed to step away from it.
Yeah.
And selfishly, that was really hard.
Yeah.
And it wasn't what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But I was obedient in that. And I think God walked me through it. And so I didn't realize at that point when I had, notified them that I wasn't returning, how much identity I put in my profession and my income and all the accolades. And again, the achievement. I'm an Enneagram 1, so I don't know. So it probably explains a lot. And so I just felt like being at home with children, I was giving, at that time of mine, I was giving up so much.
All the things that made you.
Right. Yeah. And that felt scary, but it also felt like it wasn't enough. Until I really, I had a lot more time, which sounds silly with 2 young kids, but I had time to kind of get into scripture and the word, and I had time to focus. And so during that time, we were at a church in Brentwood that we were members at, and they did the ladies there did a Zoom Bible class on Christy McClellan's study on Jesus and women. So that was kind of the first time that I really got back into scripture and studying. I mean, I did it before, but not like on my own time. Really had an hour to devote every day to kind of sit in that and prayer and just learning all over again. And so in that study, one of the key emphasis was how, it was sort of this Western view versus Eastern view, and how we in the Western world tend to read scripture and digest it for things that will tell us more about ourselves. Like, how do I see myself in the story of David?
Yeah.
How do I see myself, running like Jonah did? So, and I always did that. Like in my mind, that was my default. And so in her study, it was more like, we need to look at this, like, what does this tell us about who God is?
Yes. The Bible's not about you. It's about God.
Exactly.
I had a professor who, when he said that, I was like, that is the smartest thing I've ever heard. How did I miss this forever?
Right. And in, my sort of immature walk, I never thought that way. So then I was just trying to absorb everything and look at everything differently. And so, I did that study, and then I did another one. And then it was all like, I was listening to sermons and podcasts and just trying to just learn and look at, okay, I'm having this identity crisis anyway. Like, who does God say I am?
Yeah.
Like, let's put some weight in that now because this other stuff has not been working. Yeah. So I think another thing that really taught me a lot during that time as well was, because COVID was still going on, my oldest was about to be in kindergarten. And so I just wanted her to have a normal school experience, like a normal kindergarten, right? I didn't want her to start and then school shut down and then we're back in, virtual.
Back and forth. And
yeah. So I chose that year to homeschool her and just, let's have a steady rhythm, a pace. Let's make this feel as normal as we can. And so the curriculum that I chose was called The Good and the Beautiful. But it's all about like looking at God as, like his craftsmanship and just creation as a whole. Like everything she learned had this parallel to what it looks like to, look at it from God as a creator. And so all the applications of that, like instead of just reading about things in a book, we were outside and we were taking, it all in. And I remember we had this day at Cheekwood. So one of my things as, my stay-at-home mom was, we're going to get Cheekwood Pass. So we would go there a lot, actually, and just, do our studies there. And I just remember being, on a hill, and we had set up our picnic and had our peanut butter and jellies, and I had my kids there. And I just remember, like, in that moment thinking, this was God's plan for me.
Yeah.
This is that moment. Like, this is that fullness that you read about. Like this, and had I chosen that moment for myself, never, that was never part of my plan that I would have, I reluctantly got there, but I just felt like it was all God and him bringing me to that moment and how much, I enjoyed it.
Your plan, you would have been looking out the window at work over a laptop that day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. But I also kind of, as I was caring for my family and, sort of in a better place in my walk with God, I felt like, okay, what about all these other children? I can only pour into my kids so much. Like, I know there's broken homes and broken families and kids that don't have this, and that what I was able to give them was an extreme luxury, for our family, and to step back. And, Ben was so supportive, I think, through all of that as well. And it was important, but I remember seeing a post around that time for CASA advocates looking for volunteers. And I had worked with someone previously who was on the CASA Williamson County Board, so I knew a little bit about what it was, but I didn't really know. So it's an acronym that stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. So what CASA volunteers do, are they really, are in the children's lives and people that are children that have been or in state custody due to child neglect and abuse. And so, again, a very hard place to want to be.
Yeah, the happiest place on earth.
Right.
If anyone's in this system, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I don't know. I just, again, was kind of praying about it. I went to the interview and did the training, and I felt like, again, I needed to do more. I don't think, in your study, like, God ever tells us to sit and be comfortable, you know?
I wish.
Yeah. And so I was starting to feel real comfortable where I was, and like, oh, look at all, I've got blessings on blessings. And so anyway, I was sitting in a place where I was starting to feel comfortable. And so once I was sworn in, received my first case. I think when I started, I thought, I'm going to do this for the children, but it was so much more. It's the families, it's the foster families, it's the grandparents that are stepping in to be parents. It's working alongside DCS workers, and just it was a hard place to be in, but there was so much love, and people trying, like people really trying. And so it was intimidating because I found it really hard to be relatable with some of the families. And so, here I was, I didn't know what it was like to be a single mom, dealing with a daily addiction, or, working job to job, or just keeping a job. It was very intimidating for me. So stepping into that, I thought, well, what help am I going to offer? And I think I learned pretty quickly that, again, listening is important, and just showing up. I mean, being a familiar face, being someone that would sit and wait for 3 hours outside of a courtroom with somebody. And so I think I learned that while my impact maybe wasn't as big as I wished it could have been in some of those situations, I couldn't fix everything.
Yeah.
I had to just remember, these are God's children first.
Yeah. And
there are these people around. And so we're all here. We're working for the same thing, and you had to have hope in that. Mm-hmm. But it was still difficult, very difficult.
That work is a really tough work, because you find out just how a lot of people live that you don't ever see. Mm-hmm. And then when you see the effects of addiction or mental health issues, or even just plain old-fashioned bad choices, and who's paying the price?
Yeah.
A 6-year-old. There's no world where you want to sit by while that's going on.
Right. Yeah. But I think that, in being new to Dixon County during that time too, there's so much love in this community. I can't even begin to tell you all of the people from the recovery centers that would be in the court. I mean, you learn a lot waiting in a courtroom.
Yes, you do.
That long for cases to be heard. And just the people that, like I said, just continued to show up and support. And, I found there were just small things that you could help with. Like, a mom going through that struggle is not going to know when soccer signups are.
Right.
Or know how to kind of navigate things as easily or be aware of things like you take for granted. So there was a lot of that too. And so I did that for a while. And then my daughter finished up kindergarten. She was getting ready to start first grade. And so, restrictions were kind of lifted. And at that point, we did want for her a more traditional school experience like we had had. And just for the socialization aspect of it. So we enrolled her in school, and then my littlest had started preschool, and then I went back to work. So
how has that transition been?
I eased into it because I knew I didn't want to take on too much and kind of get in a place where before I left, kind of being burnt out. So I'm fully remote. So, I can be there to get the kids from school. Cool. If somebody's sick, I'm there. And so I feel like that's really important. But I have to put on the brakes sometimes, which is hard. And I have to say no, which is hard. But I do know, and I can realize when I start to fall back into bad habits.
One of the things that you talked about that I think is maybe one of the most important things is how easy it was for your identity to get tied up in your career. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a thing that I think happens every day of the week. But not even just a career thing. I think there are a lot of people who their identity, if it doesn't get tied up in career, becomes their identity as a parent, or their identity as the boyfriend, or the athlete, or whatever. And one of the things that I want to scream from the rooftops in ministry is, if your identity is in something besides your value in Christ, you are setting yourself up to fail, because anything else will change, everything else will end. Yeah. I think when you say that lesson, from the pulpit or in a Bible class at church, people are like, yeah. Yeah. But until you have those moments where your identity gets taken from you, you don't understand that.
No. Yeah. And again, you don't see it as a bad thing, right? Yeah. You're working hard.
I'm a hard worker. I'm a good mom. I'm a good,
right. But it can be too much. Yeah. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So we've talked all this time, and you're not even going to tell any stories about being Miss Ohio? That's...
I mean, that, it's a blip, it was cool, but I also, not to, talk about the dark side. I think during that time was the start of Facebook. And so, it was kind of everything was splashed out there, and then there were mean comments. And so I developed a lot of a lot of body image issues from that time. So while there are great aspects to it. Yeah. But I don't know that, if my daughters came and said, hey, I want to do it, I don't know that I would be promoting it.
I would have a hard time being excited about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I get weirded out by the fairest of the fair thing. I mean, when you get
I don't know what that is.
They have a pageant at the county fair here, and they put pictures of all of the kids in the newspaper that week.
Oh, okay.
And Leslie tells me I'm a horrible person, but the first time I got a copy of the newspaper that week, and they have it for all ages, so it's from the babies through the whatever the adults version is.
Okay.
They have a special needs thing, which I think that's kind of beautiful in its own way, but I refer to them as the pedophile pages.
Oh.
Because it just feels very weird. It feels, I'm not, look, people have their hobbies, whatever. I'm not railing against pageants. Yeah. It just feels, we have a world that's so full of superficial and beauty.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to want to push more of that.
Right.
But I do want to appreciate the gifts God has given people. Like, I don't want to shut that door, but I don't want to.
Anything where you're sitting there and judging someone and putting a score to, that's what I
especially when
struggle
some of the
with.
things are inherent to a person.
Mm-hmm.
They're not behaviors. They're not choice.
Exactly.
You know, if you got up there and they were judging you on your ability to score the grants and to teach the kids.
They do that too.
You know,
by the way. They sort of-
I'd be a lot more on board, but when it's, and maybe this is just my my warped perspective as an ugly guy, you know, I don't know, but I imagine that I cannot imagine what it was like to have to read the comments about yourself on Facebook.
Yeah, it was tough.
It makes me angry, and it's not my story, you know?
Yeah, it was. And I feel for kids now. You know, I don't even feel old enough to call them kids, but that feels weird. But I do. It's just, I don't know. So, I mean, I will say, I was sort of, I don't want to say I was terrified of public speaking, but I will say there were benefits to it, you know, just getting up in front of people, speaking or interviewing. You know, there's a lot of interviewing and a lot of one-on-one conversation that helped me later on in life. But I would say for the most part, you know, take it or leave it.
Do you have any good miscongeniality jokes or?
Not really.
Okay. Well, I just, one of the stories that I've told a few times, when I was in middle school, one of my friends was a cheerleader.
Okay.
And there was a little kid at church, probably a 6 or 7 year old. My wallet was sitting next to me on the bus of a church trip. And there, her picture was in there. She'd given me that picture. I was kind of proud of that.
Yeah.
And the kid said, "Who's that?" And one of the high school kids sitting next to me said, "That's his girlfriend." And the little 6-year-old just started laughing and said, "That's not true." So there's my backstory on this one. My 6th grade shame. So it's amazing the cool ways that God prepares us to do neat things and use us in different paths and just. You talked about a lot of people who made a difference. You talked about your mother-in-law. You talked about your grandmother, your parents, your neighbors, your community, these Bible study groups. We were griping about the COVID era, but were it not for the COVID era, you wouldn't have had the Zoom Bible study.
Right. Yeah.
God knows what he's doing.
Maybe I wouldn't have stayed home with my kids, Maybe I wouldn't have had that time.
Yeah.
That decision may have been harder.
I bet it would have. Bet it would have. Well, this was cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have anything else you'd like to share today?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we have survived.
All right.
Another Rough Drafts podcast. Friends, thank you so much for listening today. I hope that if you're willing to, you'll share this with a friend, and maybe go say something nice to somebody on Facebook today. Maybe that's a takeaway. That's the plan. Until next time, I can't wait to hear what God does in your story.
Thanks for listening to Rough Drafts. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. While you are at it, help us spread the word by leaving a rating and review. Until next time, let's keep looking for how God writes his love into our stories.